Yo, what's happening? You are about to experience a private, exclusive, members only Ask Me Anything with Chris Van Vliet. Four-time Emmy Award-winning Chris Van Vliet. This is from my community, GrowGetters Only. We're a bunch of growth-oriented go-getters, business professionals crushing it in business and life. And ultimately, GrowGetters Only is a place where listeners and other entrepreneurs get to meet our very guests, get to ask them questions, get peer-to-peer accountability, the whole shabam. And yeah, this isn't a big pitch or anything. I'm about to play this full Ask Me Anything that was private, uninterrupted. But I did want to tell you this. We want good people. We want grow-getters. If you are one of them, first month's on me. First month will be on me, just $1 for 30 days. You can come meet some of our very guests. You can watch all the replays. And again, you just got to go to growgettersonly.com, growgettersonly.com. All right. Now, uninterrupted, Chris Van Vliet at GrowGetters Only. Hope you guys enjoy it.
You're listening to the Real Business Connections Network. Real Business Connections Network. Powered by Balbert Marketing, LLC. Subscribe now and check us out at realbusinessconnections.com. Enjoy the show.
He's a four-time Emmy Award-winning interviewer. He has the top wrestling podcast on earth. So maybe we'll nerd out about wrestling a little bit. And he's just a curious person, a great content creator, and an incredible interviewer. So, Chris, we're going to do an Ask Me Anything. So, guys, start raising your hand. You can physically do it or virtually do it. You can put it in the chat. But to start us off, I said a couple cool things, like four-time Emmy Award winner. Take as much time as you need. Give us a little bit about your background. It's not like you just rolled out of bed and became a superstar.
Well, thank you for the very warm welcome from you, Ben, and from everybody else. First of all, congrats for being here. Ben is an absolute rock star and a killer. You guys already know that. So you being part of Ben's group, you're already on the right path here. And I've learned a lot from the conversations that I've had with Ben, and I'm pumped to be able to share some knowledge with you guys today. Please fire away with any questions that you have as we get going here. But a little background on me. I'm a Canadian, so I was born and raised just outside of Toronto, and I've worked as a broadcaster for my whole career. My goal, my dream from being a 4-year-old kid was to work in broadcasting. I had a Fisher-Price tape recorder when I was a kid, and I would pretend to be the radio DJs that I heard on the radio, like recording on actual like cassette tapes. And fast forward to being in high school, we had a class called Communication Studies where we made television programs every single week. I just thought it was fun. I just thought it was a cool thing to do. I didn't realize that this was actually something that I could try really, hard to turn into a career as well. So I ran for vice president in my high school just because that was the person who got to do the morning announcements. And I thought of it as my own like personal radio show. It's always been something that's driven me, is the idea behind broadcasting really is storytelling. And that's also the idea behind sales and also marketing as well, is being able to tell that story effectively and efficiently. And that's what's always driven me. To make a pretty long story short here, I went to college for communication studies, had a great time there, learned a little bit, but also had the best time living with my best friends. And I had an epiphany in my senior year. It hit me one day that when we graduated at the end of that year, we were going to have to go work for the rest of our lives. And I decided in that exact moment that I didn't want to be one of those people who hated Sunday because, Monday was the next day. I didn't want to hate going to work. And I just reached out to every radio station and every TV station in my college town and said, hey, I'm passionate about broadcasting. Can I just come in, volunteer, and see how it's done in the real world? Got a lot of no's, got a lot of no responses, but I did start to get some inroads. I worked as a volunteer at a radio station and worked on their street team, handing out like stickers and stuff. I worked at a volunteer television station behind the scenes. And then one radio station said, well, we don't take on volunteers. How would you like a job as a board operator? And that's kind of where my career began, with this idea of like, I wanted to do everything in my power at that point in my life, 21 years old, so that I wouldn't look back when I was 70 or 80 or 90 and go, man, it would have been nice. I wish I had done this. I wanted to give my absolute all at that point in time. And one little step led to another little step that led to another one. And now I'm fortunate to say that I've worked in broadcasting my whole career. I've covered the Oscars and the Grammys. I've interviewed people like Tom Cruise and Steven Spielberg and Julia Roberts and The Rock and John Cena and many other people. And if we're talking about big wins, Ben, my YouTube channel just hit 1 billion views last month. So I have two YouTube channels. One is my main one. It's just my name here. I'll put it in the chat. Maybe Ben could put it in the chat. My main one's just my full name, and that's where the full interviews go. And then I have a second channel, which is oh, that was very quick. Wow, thank you. My second one's my clips channel, where we put the shorts and the clips, and that's the one that hit. Now it's at 1.1 billion views. And the idea behind this is we just took the long interviews, did whatever we could to chop them up into as many bite-sized little pieces as we could. And now, while I do a little bit of freelance for radio and TV, my full-time job now is podcaster, YouTuber / content creator. And I'm really passionate about that world. I'm passionate about, number one, connecting with people and sharing those conversations. And number two, trying to get the word out to other people. Because my whole thing is, I'm just curious about how people who are successful and at the top of their game were able to accomplish the things that they've accomplished. And I want to be able to reverse engineer that back to where we're at in our journey. Because so often on social media, we just see the finished product. We just see, Tom Brady with the Super Bowl rings, or we see the actor on stage holding the Oscar, but we don't see the bumps along the road to get there. And that's a big part of what I want to do on my show, is figure out like, oh, you got fired from that thing? Or, oh, this other traumatic thing happened in your life and you were able to overcome that to become the star that you are today. Let's break that down. So that's my story in a nutshell there. Oh, and by the way, since we were talking about locations earlier, I'm based in Orange County, California now. But by way of Toronto to Vancouver to Cleveland to Miami to Fort Lauderdale to Cincinnati to Los Angeles, now Orange County. So I've been quite a few places in that journey.
Love it. And guys, raise your hand if you have a question. But Chris, why do you think, let's reverse engineer like you said. Why do you think you have 1 billion views and we don't? What did you do?
I think the biggest thing is, I like to think of, I went all in on shorts 2 years ago. I paid an editor to make 30 reels in 30 days, which at the time for me was, I was posting like 1 reel a month. We're going back to like this, maybe 2.5 years ago, the start of 2022. And I was realizing I'd have these hour-long conversations, but the average person's not going to tune in for a whole hour of a podcast. It's a big ask, right? If someone texts you a link and they say, oh, this podcast is so good, you got to go check this out. And you click on it and the runtime's 1 hour and 27 minutes. Chances are you're probably not even going to start that. So I started to think about clips as like the breadcrumbs. These are the little breadcrumbs. They're 43 seconds long. They're 26 seconds long, whatever they are. If someone texts you one of those, chances are you're not only going to hit play, you're going to probably watch most of that. I like to think of those as the breadcrumbs. That if you like those breadcrumbs, maybe you'll go looking for the slice of bread, which for me is the clip, the 2 to 5 to 7 minute clip on the CVV Clips channel I have. And if you really like the slice of bread, maybe, hopefully, you'll go looking for the loaf of bread, which is the full piece of content, which is the full episode on either YouTube or the podcast. So clips for me, it started at 1 a day. Now we're doing something like 110, 120 clips a month. And I'm hoping that you just put enough of these in front of enough people. If you do 100 a month or more than 100 a month, it's 1,200 a year. At some point in time, hopefully with the algorithm and the explore page and the FYP on TikTok, those are going to get in front of the right people that are into your niche, and sometimes get in front of the decision makers. The amount of A-list people that I've went and shook their hand to introduce myself, and they go, I know who you are. I've seen your stuff before. It's like, oh my gosh, we're doing something right here. So I think the short answer, Ben, is all in on short form content for me. Changed everything.
And one thing I think you can highlight is you were talking with A-list people. You had great success prior to this, but you even niched down, which a lot of people would think, oh, he's talking to all the A-listers. Why is he talking about one specific niche? Why did you kind of transition to focus directly on wrestling?
So, working as an entertainment reporter, you have access to interview people all across entertainment. So, I've interviewed a lot of actors, directors, comedians. Then every once in a while, WWE would come to town, and I'm a wrestling fan. I've been a wrestling fan my whole life. There was a point in time when I wanted to be a pro wrestler. I went to wrestling school, learned how to fall correctly, learned how to run the ropes, all that stuff. So, wrestling would come to town. And I remember the first time I asked my boss, I said, could we interview a wrestler? She's like, yeah, sure. We've done that before. Why not? And I'm like, oh my gosh, as a fan, I'm going to get paid to talk to a wrestler. This is mind blowing to me. So we would kind of pepper in the wrestling interviews once, twice, maybe 3 times a year. And with the old school model of broadcasting, which still does exist, unless you're watching Channel 19 at exactly 6:14 p.m. on that exact Thursday, and you live within this 30-mile radius where this local CBS station airs, which is what I was on at the time, you'd never see it. And I was having these conversations a lot of times with wrestlers where I'm asking questions that I wanted to know as a fan that I knew other fans might be interested in as well. I just started taking these interviews and putting them on YouTube. One is kind of like a digital library. Like I can come back to this in a year or two if I ever want to see this again. But number two, if other fans want to see this and they don't live in this general region, they can check it out as well. That was really where it began for me. So some of the celebrity interviews did kind of well. Some of them were getting a decent amount of views, but I found that every time I interviewed a wrestler, they were doing really well. So I just kind of started to over time lean into that a little bit of like, all right, well, what if it's more than twice a year? What if I go out of my way and drive a little bit to this convention where someone is appearing? What if we do that interview? And then what if next time I fly to do an interview for a movie, what if while I'm in town, I reach out to a wrestler that lives there? I started kind of building on that. And all of this is to say, if I can now make a career out of talking to pro wrestlers, like that is a niche on a niche on a niche. If I can do that, then whatever the thing is that you're interested in or you're interested in or you've niched down onto, there is most certainly a career in there and a bunch of revenue in there for you.
Okay, guys, so I think we established a good background. I want to open to the group, get some personal questions. And you put a question in the chat, so I'd like you to start if you'd like.
Sure.
Ask your question.
You know, Chris, I consumed a bunch of breadcrumbs, and I don't even like wrestling necessarily, but the one where the guys are slapping you,
Yes.
was that like one of the craziest things that you've done? Or I'm sure, I mean, I only scratched the surface of your content, but it got me thinking also the 2 questions, the craziest thing you've done, and what's the content that's gotten the best ROI?
That's a great question. And so to put a little context on this, in wrestling, there's a thing called a chop, where someone will take an open hand, slap it on their opponent's chest. It makes a really loud noise. And also you do it enough times, it leaves a red mark on their chest, but doesn't really hurt them that much. I went to a wrestling school that my friends own in Central Florida. And my whole idea was I trained a little bit as a wrestler. I'll get in the ring and we'll make a quick little video and who knows what will happen. And my friend who's the instructor goes, what if at the end we give you a chop? And I said, I guess. I mean, that's not really that interesting. What if instead we had all your students line up and each one of them gave me a chop? And there were 8 students, 2 instructors. And he goes, great, no problem. Everybody gets 2. Let's get started. And I was like, what did I just sign up for? So it went from, will you take one of these to I'm now going to take 20 of them. And I wasn't going to say no. The cameras were rolling. So that, I don't know if that was the craziest, certainly the dumbest thing I've ever done. My chest looked like it was, I don't know, like raw hamburger meat for like a week. So that was definitely a good one. I think that got across all platforms, 40, 50 million views, something like that. It's interesting. I was just in Cleveland for SummerSlam, which is a big WWE event. The amount of people who still 5.5 years later are coming up to me going, how does your chest feel from that? Or you're crazy for doing that. It certainly left a mark, pun intended, not just on me, but on everybody who watched it. So that's one for sure. I think in terms of ROI, there were a few times when I was still working in local news. So still working, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. I was in Miami as a correspondent for the Fox station there. And I had the opportunity to interview Tony Khan at the time, who is not only his dad owns the Jacksonville Jaguars, he also owned and started AEW, which is the rival wrestling company to WWE. He said he would do an interview with me. And I drove from Miami to Jacksonville, which is like a 5-ish hour drive, drove there to do a 35-minute interview to then get in my car and like turn around and drive right back. So I think it was things like that. It's the idea for me that if you're willing to do what other people aren't willing to do, you're going to get the results that other people aren't willing to get. And I took a vacation day from work to do that. And then 10 or 11 hours in the car to do that. And that got a whole bunch of views. And it was an interview that I think he'd only done one or two other interviews at that point in time. That was a really big one. Maybe not in terms of an investment of money, but certainly a ton of time was invested in that in order to get this interview done and then up as quickly as possible. So I think that's the one that comes to mind the quickest for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Adrienne Hart, go ahead.
Chris, I was wondering, do you still get starstruck or intimidated? And if you do you have a technique to kind of recalibrate before an interview or meeting?
I think for me, I still put a lot of pressure on myself of like, will this be good? Like when you're standing outside of the room that The Rock is sitting in and you see his name like on the door, you're like, he's The Rock. I grew up watching him. Like, there's that element to it, but more it's the like, I only have a handful of minutes with him. I only have a certain amount of time. Will it go well? That's where the pressure really comes from for me. I feel like you just got to remember that these are people as well. And I think that that's been a big thing for me is like, these are people who had dreams and goals and just chased after them and went after them. And now they're doing them on the biggest scale, the biggest stage. But I don't think I get starstruck so much anymore other than like putting pressure on myself of like, this better be good, like the hope of like, this better live up to the expectations that I have. And it's a quote from Tony Robbins that I've really repeated to myself a lot recently. And if you can trade your expectations for appreciation, you'll never be disappointed, right? And I live so much with gratitude. I wake up every day. I say out loud 3 things I'm grateful for. My wife and I do it before we go to bed every night. Completely changes your life. It's now the question I ask at the end of every interview too. What are 3 things that my guest is grateful for? So now I start to think in terms of like, I'm just so appreciative to be here, to be able to do this, share this conversation with someone, and then hopefully somebody who's listening or watching can get something out of it as well. But I don't know if that'll ever go away. The idea of like, this better be good. If this better, I hope this can live up to what I want it to be. How do you get the rockets to go in front of your face like that, Ben? That was amazing. Oh, and Jane as well.
Some new Zoom React feature.
Oh, geez. But thank you so much for the question, Adrienne.
Jane, you had lowered your hand. Did you still have a question?
Because you put my hand in the chat. Put my name in the chat. Anyway.
Perfect.
Yes. What you mentioned niche, and we talk about niche all the time. And just recently on LinkedIn, I saw someone else. He's a media company, but he zoned in on commercial roofers of all things. And you thought, commercial roofers, but he's killing it. And I know that everyone on here, we all see a broad spectrum that, how did you finally just zone in on the one? Because every time I zone in on the one, other people start appearing that have nothing to do with that I know, oh my God, they need help too. So how do you really keep that zoned in?
For me, I made a decision last April. So my podcast for a long time was I'm going to talk to people who are the best, whether they are actors or comedians or entrepreneurs or directors or whatever. A lot of athletes as well. And last year, again, I'm going to, hyper niche down on wrestling here with this example. WrestleMania was in Los Angeles, where I live. So WrestleMania was here. I was like, if I can get a bunch of interviews here, WrestleMania was first weekend of April. If I can get a bunch of interviews here, could I go the entire month here with just focusing on wrestling? Oh, I can. And then I looked at the numbers, and then April was my best month ever on the podcast. And I went, oh, well, that's a clue right there. Could I do the same thing in May? Did the same thing in May. Then May was my best month. Could I do the same thing in June? Oh, now June was better than May. And now every single month since has beat the previous month. So for me, I just kind of took the clues that were in front of me. First, I had to set up, the runway for this, right? So I do 2 episodes, 2 guests a week, every Tuesday and Thursday. So it's a lot. It's a lot of prep. It's a lot of planning. It's 104 episodes a year. Plus I do solo episodes as well on Fridays. So it's like, okay, do I have the runway to do this? Can I give myself that? That was number one for me. If I couldn't even line up 8 guests that month, there was going to be no hope for me to even try to do this. Okay, I could set up the runway. All right, well, let's just experiment and see what happens. Okay, well, that worked pretty well. Can I keep this going now? That was really it for me. And also, I think nobody's going to get, I just feel like it's difficult to be successful when you're trying to be the jack of all trades. I think when you can really hone down on and hone in on, I'm the wrestling podcaster now. And I think at this time last year, my podcast was maybe on the charts, I don't know, 12, 15, something like that. I just kept honing in on it. And now it's consistently the number one, at least wrestling podcast on the chart. And I think consistency is key too. I think consistency is a key when you're talking about not just building a brand or not just content creation, but also niching down too. Like, can you consistently continue to do this week after week, then month after month, and then as you extrapolate out, year after year as well? Thank you for that, Jane.
Andrew Biernat, go ahead.
What's going on? Hey, what's up, Chris?
What's up?
Dude, doing great, man. So my question is, you do a lot of interviews, asking questions and getting stories out of people. Do you have a process or something that you lean into to ask good questions that are going to elicit those interesting stories?
So I like to start with a base of like, who is this person? What are they all about? And I know that people feel a certain way about Wikipedia, because anybody can put anything on there. But the thing that I love about it is it gives you a really good framework and skeleton for what their career is. Where did they start to where did they go? And, where are they now? That's where I really begin my process. I also like to listen to a handful of their podcasts. I kind of feel like I'm now spending some time with them. If you listen to 3 podcasts where that person's been a guest, it's like you've spent 3, dinner dates with them or 3, hangouts with them, and you get a feel for what their cadence is. You get a feel for what their type of humor is. That's kind of the basis of this. I now also start to think about interviews in like terms of like, all right, we're going to get a full story here about their life and where they've been and where they are now, and also where they're going. But I want to hit on what I call like their greatest hits. So if there's big moments in their life, I want to like ask them that maybe in a way that they've never been asked it before, maybe find a roundabout way to ask that. Because I know that selfishly, if I clip that out, it's going to be a great TikTok. It's going to be a great reel. It's going to be a great YouTube short. So that's kind of where I begin the process. And I also try to think like genuinely from a place of curiosity. Like I genuinely like will ask a lot of questions that I just want to know the answer to. And sometimes you'll Google that and you're like, oh, how have they never talked about this before? That's crazy. Or I'll listen to an interview or read an interview with them, and there's like a glaring question that like comes from their answer that doesn't get answered. Like there's a follow-up question that wasn't asked. So sometimes I'll go, I heard your interview with so-and-so. It really made me think about this. And that will also sometimes lead to something else. I think a big thing that also isn't talked about with interviewing is don't be afraid to say like, I don't know. Like if they say, oh, do you know so-and-so, or do you remember such and such? It's okay to go, no, I'm not sure. Or what do you mean by that? And that in those situations, you're putting yourself in your audience's shoes, and maybe they don't know what's being referenced here. And that now allows for a much larger conversation. So that's really how I start to think about it. But it always starts for me with real curiosity of like, how'd that person get to be where they're at? And how can I learn from that myself? And then hopefully through me learning from that, other people who are listening can learn from it as well. Thanks, Andrew.
Nick, it's your turn. Go ahead.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, Nick.
The most important question I think we should be asking here is like, who was your favorite wrestler growing up? I do have a second one that might be a little bit harder than that one. It has to do with, difficult interviews, right? I looked through your content. I'm a big Smashing Pumpkins fan. I saw you interview Billy Corgan. It looks like a couple times. He's a big wrestler, and I've heard he's really hard to interview about his music, but he opens up more with like wrestling, because that's one of his other passions. And I just wanted to hear from your perspective, like, how have you dealt with difficult interviews? Like what maybe was the most difficult interview for you? Something along those lines. I'd just love to hear your perspective on that.
So, Nick, my favorite wrestler growing up was The Rock. I became a huge wrestling fan in the late 90s. It was called the Attitude Era when, The Rock and Stone Cold and The Undertaker and Mick Foley and Kane and Triple H, they were all the big stars at that point in time. So fast forward, what would it have been? I did my first interview with The Rock in 2012. I've now interviewed him 10 times. Not that I'm counting or anything, but I think it's like 10 times. That was a pretty cool full circle moment to like The Rock. I was also the guy in high school. I would ask people questions walking down the hall just so I could shout, "It doesn't matter what you think," which is The Rock's catchphrase.
Yeah.
So Rock was my guy growing up. I feel like in those formidable years of my life, I took a lot of his charisma and wanted to, emulate that. In terms of difficult interviews, Billy Corgan, I think, is just, he just thinks on a different level from a lot of guests that I've interviewed. And I don't think it's that he doesn't like talking about music. I think it's that he's been asked so many of the same types of questions all the time. And, when you've been in music for 30 plus years like him, I don't think there's much that he's heard that's new. I also think there's a lot of people that talk to him about music and only talk about like that one Smashing Pumpkins album that was massive. And he's so passionate about the music that he's currently making and still doing that I feel like it's like, oh, you want me to tell this story again? So trying to find different ways to ask that was an interesting challenge. I had speaking of tough interviews, I had one recently, and it just felt like the person maybe didn't want to be there. I don't know. Maybe they were having a rough day. I had written out maybe 12 or 15 questions / topics, and we burned through them in like 20 minutes. And I'm like, okay, I was planning for this to go an hour, but what are we going to do now? And I kept trying to, pull conversation out of this person. It just didn't seem to be happening. So I just wrapped up the interview a little bit earlier. I think it was 32 minutes or something. I was just like, I guess that's it. And I think the lesson there is like, you can't try to make something happen that's not going to happen. With the good comes the bad. And I was really trying to key in on things that this person was passionate about, but the answers were just short. And that was just, it was what it was. But when we're talking about passion, like you get Billy Corgan on the show, he loves to talk about wrestling. We could talk about wrestling for like 4 hours. With music, it's a bit more difficult of a conversation.
Yeah.
I also think that like, just because I had an hour in my mind with this other interview that I expected the interview to go, just because it went short, it doesn't mean it's like a failure in any sort of way. It's just some conversations flow and some don't. And Andrew, did you just put Stone Cold Steve Austin behind you there? What? Amazing. So I think that, they're not all going to be home runs. But I think you can hope to at least, if we're going to keep with the baseball metaphor, hope to at least get on base, hope it's a single or a double, triple would be a big win. They're not all going to be home runs though.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I've had the opportunity to meet Mick Foley, and what I like about him and a lot of the other wrestlers is how intelligent they are. They
Yeah,
don't
he's
always
great.
come across that way on the screen when they're doing their thing. But it amazes me some of the insights that he had. He's a Cortland alum, and I work in higher ed.
Oh, awesome! Yeah, he's great.
So, yeah,
big Mick Foley guy. I like him.
yeah. Thank you.
No, thanks, Nick.
Darlene, you're next.
Hey, thank you so much for being here today. I have a fun fact. One of my good friends' grandpa was Gordon Sully, who was full-time announcer of wrestling. So I thought you might be interested in that. And also, I would love to hear, is there somebody that you had interviewed and something they said or something they shared inspired you or really made a huge impact on your life, just from that interview?
Yeah. So there's one that immediately pops to mind, Darlene. I was interviewing John Cena. This was like 5 years ago. And I did an interview with him at WrestleMania 35 for anybody who's a wrestling fan in New York. He only did one interview that weekend, and a mutual friend of ours connected us to make this happen. And it wasn't even it wasn't even a question that elicited this response. He just said something during this interview that has changed my life at that point in time and has forever changed my life. He said 3 words that I'll never forget. He said, "Control the controllable." And it's the idea that like you can't control what other people say, you can't control what other people do, but what you can control is how you react to those things. And I was aware of this concept before, but I'd never had it distilled down so simplistically that I could remember it so well. And that's really stuck with me. That idea of control the controllable, control what you can control. And then another one is, it was an interview with The Rock. And if you think about The Rock and all the success that he's had and being one of the biggest stars on the planet right now, his original goal was to play in the NFL. And it's crazy to think about The Rock as a, quote unquote failure in some sort of way of like, his goal was to play in the NFL. He got cut from the CFL. And I could say that as a Canadian myself, but he got cut from the, Canadian Football League. Like, he wasn't even good enough to play in the CFL. And then he had to go on a different path and figure life out. And I asked him, if you could go back and change things to live that dream that you wanted, because I was interviewing him for Ballers, where he plays a retired NFL player, Spencer Strathmore. I was like, if you could live that life that your character lived, would you change anything? And he talked about the idea of how sometimes the best things in life are the things that don't happen. And that one really struck me, of like the idea of like, I thought my life was supposed to go this way. I can't believe this thing didn't happen. And it turns out a year or 2 or 5 or 10 later, oh, wow, look how much better I am now because those things didn't happen. So those are two nuggets for me that I hang on to and think about, quite a bit. So thank you for that question, Darlene.
Thank you.
So powerful. Gabe, you're next. Go ahead.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Gabe.
Thanks so much for all these learnings. And you kind of answered some of my questions, but for context, I'm a newbie in the podcast world, just 1 year and a half, 75 episodes. And I started with scripted questions. And for like half a year, I go unscripted, sometimes completely unprepared, just have a small background about my guest because I enjoy it more. And I feel like conversation flows much more nicer, in my case at least. And my question to you is, how do you turn this into a full-time thing? Since at this point it's just almost a hobby, but one that tapped into my business, because most of my guests either become partners or clients at some point. And I see myself doing this all my life because I enjoy talking with others, if it's not face-to-face because I'm an introvert. But how do I go from this passion to actually build a full-time thing?
Well, it sounds like you're using your podcast right now to leverage your other business. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
I mean, that sounds like a great way to utilize your podcast, because I feel like, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's a really like very small percentage of people who actually earn any sort of income from podcasting. And then a fraction of the fraction is making a living off of it. So I think if you're able to use this as kind of networking that will then leverage your other business, you're already miles ahead of the game here. The biggest thing I always tell people is to be consistent. And it sounds like you're doing that. If you're a year and a half into this and 75 episodes in, I would guess you're doing one a week, right?
Yes, correct. And I just took a 5 weeks break until last weekend when Ben was the guest.
Hey, so I think being consistent is massive, and that's huge. And I think especially as you start to build your audience, if you say I'm going to have a podcast episode every Tuesday, as you build your audience, they're now expecting one every single Tuesday. So no matter what's going on in your life, no matter how busy you are, no matter what the wife or the husband or the kids are doing, you got to put out an episode. And that's where I'm at now of like, they're expecting this. So I think consistency is key. Also, if you can continue to build those relationships, the best thing about podcasting is you can now have a conversation with someone that probably wouldn't have said yes to you going to lunch with them, probably wouldn't have said yes to you, quote unquote, picking their brain. But all of a sudden you give them a platform of like, can you come on the podcast? And can I put this out to my audience and my listeners? Well, that changes everything. So I think you're already on that path. I wouldn't worry so much about trying to get ad revenue from, any Athletic Greens or from Indeed.com, or I'm trying to think of all the other podcast sponsors, Blue Chew. Like you're getting ad revenue that, the handful of dollars you're going to get from that it's so minor compared to one, the relationships you're building, and two, the networking and other business you're able to bring into your business. I would actually make that the main focus of like, how can you continue to drive more customers, more clients to your business? That's going to be way more powerful than a $20 CPM, which extrapolate that out. If you've got 1,000 downloads an episode, you're making $20. Like, is it really worth it? No, and that's why it's the fraction of the fraction who are actually able to make a living off of this. So I think a podcast is a much better tool to drive new clients and new customer acquisition to your business.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's reassuring.
Yeah.
I joked in the chat like today, I don't think I would have got an hour 2 times with Chris if I didn't have a podcast. And if we hadn't have done that and collaborated together, he might have never came to this group. I'm not some superhuman. I just started a podcast and I asked nicely.
And I think also with the podcast, perception is reality, right? If you're framed like this and you sound like garbage, people are going to think your podcast is garbage. Look at Ben's setup. It looks great, sounds great. So if you're watching it, it looks good. If you're listening to it, it sounds clear. The perception here is that it's good. And I think that goes a real long way. You don't have to have a great camera, Shure SM7B mic, but just a little bit of quality goes such a long way. I say this all the time. Ben's probably heard me say this before. Best thing about podcasting is anybody can do it. But the worst thing about podcasting is also anybody can do it. And the barrier of entry is so low, which at the same time means the ability to stand out. It doesn't take that much, a decent camera, a decent mic, a little bit of preparation, a little bit of consistency. You'll stand out from the pack, boom, so quickly with that.
It might be a challenge for me being a nomad, and especially with setup and stuff, but doing small things like having a mic, and my camera is not on now, for example, but I usually use the external camera. But those are important things I didn't do at the beginning. And I had my idol in the podcast, Chris Do, and I had literally a yoga mat behind me to isolate the echo and stuff like that. And I still didn't put out that video. Even that he shared on his channel, I didn't put out the video yet. I'll just remove the background, but yeah, I should do it. Thank you so much, Chris, again.
Yeah, of course.
Jelani, please go next.
Hi, Chris.
Hey, Jelani.
You mentioned something earlier, which was going the extra mile, basically doing the things that others aren't willing to do. And a lot of times this also requires sacrifice. So it's kind of a 2-part question, but are there any things that you've had to sacrifice that you're happy that you sacrificed? And are there things that you sacrificed that you regret sacrificing?
I don't think I have any regrets, but we have a little baby. We have a 14-month little girl, and we have another baby on the way, a little boy who's going to be joining us in December. It's been, yeah, thank you. It's so exciting. I love being a dad. There's been a lot of sacrifice recently with travel. So I do all my interviews now in person because, again, going back to the point you were just referencing, Jelani, if you're willing to do what other people aren't willing to do, you're going to get results that other people aren't going to get. So there were a lot of other podcasts in my space that were doing Zoom interviews. And while Zoom interviews are great, just that if you can even be just 1% better to be able to shake someone's hand, give them a hug, look them in the eye, not have that awkward moment of like, yeah, no, sorry. No, you go. No, I'm sorry. You, which, happens a lot of times in Zoom interviews. Been a lot of travel. And in the last month, I've been to, let's see if I can get this right, Toronto, San Antonio, Asheville, North Carolina, Philly, and Minnesota, and Cleveland. So I've been in a lot of different places. So I think the biggest sacrifice here has been time away from baby, our little girl Logan, and my wife, who is pregnant. That's been difficult. I think the trade-off is now I don't really have a ton of work to do this week. So I now get to spend like the whole week just hanging out with them. But I weigh them a lot, especially, and now becoming a dad and a husband, there's a balance here of like, all right, is this worth it, right? Is it worth doing this thing? Or could we wait a month or 2 or 5 to figure out, can we do this in the future at another point in time? But I'd say that weighing pros and cons now is a huge part of what I do, of like, is the return worth this? We were talking about ROI earlier. Is the ROI worth this? Is this guest big enough? Like there was a last minute interview with Goldberg, who's a massive Hall of Fame wrestler. And he texted me and said, I can do an interview with you, but it's got to be soon. It's got to be in the next 2 weeks. And I was like, I've been away a lot. What's another, what's 48 hours in San Antonio? It's going to be worth it. Now the video has, I don't know, put it out 2 weeks ago. I think it has like 10 million views or something like that. It's like, yeah, that was probably worth it. So there's a lot of weighing is this worth it? And I've been flying a lot of guests in now, which is something I never thought I'd be doing. But, the guest lives in Tampa, for example. Is it worth me going to the airport, flying to Tampa, getting a hotel, doing the interview, then flying back? Is it worth 24, 36, 48 hours of my time? Or can I just take that same money that I was going to, allot for me to fly there, and I'll just pay to fly them in? And I just bought myself 30 hours back in my time. Been doing that a lot recently, but it is a constant battle. But I don't think any regrets. I think that all of us who are sitting here right now wouldn't be where we're at right now if it wasn't for all of the things that led up to us being here. You're just an accumulation of all of the decisions that you've made. So Back to the Future is my favorite movie. That'll be a total other tangent, but it's the idea that like, if this doesn't happen, then this doesn't happen. And if that doesn't happen, then that doesn't happen. So I think about life in terms of Back to the Future, pretty frequently.
Well, yeah, I can understand that. I mean, from your answer, I could have a million other questions, but I suppose that at the end of the day, it makes it easier for you to weigh your options if you know what you're doing it for.
Yeah, and I think that you begin with the end in mind. Like we've all heard that before, right? Like, and I think in terms of like, all right, if I can get this person for this length of time, and we talk about this, and this, oh man, I'm pretty sure that will, in the case of my content, do pretty well. So I try to extrapolate things out and think about things in those terms.
All right. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
We have time for maybe one more. I know a couple people are off camera. Last call. If not, I've got an activity quick question for Chris, but let's do this if you're open to it, Chris. So
yeah.
I love the look of your YouTube channel. So if you're open to it, bring up your YouTube and let's take a look, like the thumbnails, like just visually why it's working so well, because obviously we need to retain people by creating good content that they watch all the way through, but you have a great way of hooking people in and being visually stimulating. So let's close out to kind of see a live example of what that looks like.
Sure. So let me share my screen here real quick. This is my main channel, and you'll see that. So I think the biggest thumbnails are the most important thing for anybody who has a YouTube channel. Thumbnails are the number one most important thing. The second most important thing are the titles. And I know this is crazy. The third most important thing is the first 20 to 30 seconds. And then the content is the most important thing, because you could have the greatest content on the planet, but unless you have a great thumbnail and a great title, nobody's going to ever click on it. So you've got to realize that the majority of the people who are watching your YouTube videos are most likely watching it on a mobile device. So you've got to make your thumbnails bright and also like allow people to understand what's going on with one quick glance. There shouldn't be so many things going on there and so much text that they've got to stop and read it. They should be able to take one glance and go, oh, I know exactly what this is about. So that's why I've got a big, massive photo of the person on the left. Oh, also another big thing with thumbnails is people read thumbnails the same way they read a book, left to right. So I put the most important thing on the left-hand side of the screen, which would be the guest. And then we move from left to right. I don't think you should have any more than like 3 pieces of information on a thumbnail. So we'll use Goldberg as an example here. There's his face, there's his name, and there's a photo of him in the middle and me. So we've got Goldberg as one of the pieces of information, his name, and then me. Bright colors, big font, and then if we scroll back enough, I used to have it where the name was a little bit smaller. And I've recently changed that because I feel like these ones on this row stand out a lot more. So that's I think a really big thing of like, how can you capture somebody's attention, boom, real quick? And how can you do it in the most simplistic way of like, you're using their image, or you're using, depends what your channel is, but you're using something that catches their attention and makes them go, I need to see what this is all about. And then I trying to put the information in the title in 50-ish characters or less is also a pretty important thing. So I try to front load it with the most important thing first, and then kind of adding some other SEO words after that from there.
Boom. And if we want to learn more, we can just go straight to your channel.
Sure. Like I'll show you my clips channel too. I'll show you one other thing, because let me pull up the channel, then I'll share my screen here. I'm also heavy on shorts, like I mentioned at the very start of this, like very heavy on shorts. And I think the thing with shorts is you've got to be able to tell the story with a very simple glance here. So like this one here with like there being a red circle around his head. Well, what are we even talking about here? We've got to click on that and watch. So try to put the most interesting thing in the thumbnail. And the only way that you can choose your thumbnail with YouTube Shorts is by uploading it on your mobile device in the YouTube Studio app, and then scrolling through and picking the exact still. So like if I go by our most viewed ones here, like there's the wrestling chops we were talking about, 25 million views on this one, 24 million views on this one, 21, 18, 17 here. I think it's the idea of, can the thumbnail tell a story? Yes. Okay. Can it tell a story enough to get me to want to watch that video, even if it's just a few seconds? If the answer to that is yes, then you're doing something right.
Chris, did we miss a way we can support you? How can we keep in touch and keep advocating for what you do?
I think you put it all in the chat here. So thank you guys. If you'd be so kind as to just subscribe to my YouTube channel, even if you have no idea what wrestling is or have no interest in it, please just support a fellow creator. I think that's a big thing too, is support your fellow creators. If there's a YouTube channel that you frequently watch, but you haven't subscribed to it yet, man, subscribing goes such a long way for any creator at any level of the game. So thank you for allowing me to spend some time with you today, Ben, and for all of you guys. Great to meet all of you guys. Congrats on the success that you have right now. And I'm excited to see where all of you guys go in the future from here. And the fact that you're already in this group means you're on the right path.
Thanks again, man. I know you got to run. But
Okay.
we'll talk soon.
Thank you guys so much. Have a great day.